Regulating Psychedelics for Non-Medical Uses. So I'm not talking about medical psychedelics. That's the book. You can buy it in print, but it's also available free online as an ebook, so you don't have to buy it, but it'd be nice if you did. These are some of those other books. There's Blueprint, which is the one Cara mentioned, but we've written books on regulating cannabis and stimulants, so MDMA, amphetamines, and cocaine. That's a little bit trickier, by the way. And psychedelics, the one I'm talking about today. So I think the question is, why should we regulate psychedelics for non-medical use? And the obvious answer to that is because most psychedelic use is non-medical. And it's something that always strikes me about a lot of the popular discourse on psychedelics is that like 90% of the discourse is about therapeutic, medical use, and a sort of fairly small, quite rarefied group of spiritual, ceremonial, sort of ayahuasca retreaty type use. But the vast majority of psychedelic use, like 90% of psychedelic use, is basically people having a laugh. It's people pissing their pants with laughter in a park. It's people going to a party. It's people playing Call of Duty on the PlayStation. Most psychedelic use is in social settings and is not intentionally spiritual exploration or any of those things. And I get into arguments with people about this. I had an argument with the lovely Paul Stamets recently at a slightly weird event in London. Don't know whether any of you were there. And I said, what do you think about, how do we regulate recreational psychedelics? Because that's most psychedelic use by an overwhelming margin. It's not therapy, it's mostly... And he said, well, actually, they're not recreational drugs, they're sacred medicines. And I was like, well, yeah, they're not really, are they? Because at least for most, for young people, mushrooms it's part of their menu of recreational drugs, and we can't just deny that. That's just a fact. It is a fact. Now, yes, they are sacred medicines as well for some people in some situations, but for most people in social settings, in parties and raves and festivals where most psychedelics are being consumed, I'm talking about by volume and number. It is a recreational drug. It's about pleasure seeking. It's about sensory enhancement. Yes, you can have spiritual experiences and religious experiences and expand your consciousness and so on in a club and in a rave party, whatever, playing Call of Duty. But for most people, they're just having a laugh. And that's just a fact. And there is not, given that it's most psychedelic use is that, hardly any of the discourse around policy and law and practice concerns itself with that. And I just think that was a gap in the discussion that we wanted to fill with this book. The book focuses on the classic psychedelics, LSD, DMT, mescaline, and psilocybin, which have certain similarities in terms of their effects, risk profile, and mode of action. We didn't include ketamine because I think it exists in a slightly different space and has a different risk profile in terms of dependence and tissue damage and so on. We didn't include some of the other psychedelics. So there's obviously this. We didn't include ibogaine. It's obviously a different thing again. There's a whole debate about whether MDMA is tedious debate whether MDMA is a psychedelic or not, which I don't want to get into, but it's not. So anyway, that's what the book is focused on. Hopefully there are lessons about other that could be transferred from this into other psychedelics and drugs, but specifically we focus on those ones. Because there are a whole range of different using motivations and use contexts for psychedelics, and people use them in different ways in different environments, there isn't one way to regulate psychedelics. And we're talking about a range of different drugs as well. LSD, a huge dose of ayahuasca is very different to a recreational dose of mushrooms at a party or whatever. So what we did is we've come up with a four-tiered model that offers four different regulatory approaches that would exist in parallel. And the idea with that is that we could try and cater for, hopefully, the vast majority of different using behaviors and using contexts and using cultures, because it's not a single thing. Some people are using them in clubs, some people are using them in retreats, some people use them in the park, some people are using them at home with their mates. You have to cater for all of that. So we've come up with this four-tiered model. That's the sort of summary version of it, but I'm just going to whiz through them one at a time, so don't feel you have to expend too much mental energy on that. So the first one is a kind of decrim model, private use model, including home cultivation, foraging, and not-for-profit sharing. I think there is a certain element of psychedelic culture which is basically people either growing or foraging for psychedelic plants and using them in the privacy of their home or amongst their friends. And I don't think that there is or really should be any role for the state in that. And it's not practical anyway. The state can't really intervene in things that happen behind closed doors, or at least it's very difficult, and it takes you to a pretty scary authoritarian place. And we're not quite there yet, although they are in America. It's based on decriminalisation, that personal use and possession would not be criminalised in any way. Obviously, that's part of a wider decriminalisation which would apply to all drugs. I'm just focusing on psychedelics for now. And essentially the role of the state then becomes an educational one. So you provide people with information to allow them to make informed choices, and you encourage them to make sensible choices that minimise their risk exposure and protect their health and well-being. So that's the first model. The second model is an idea that kind of emerged from the cannabis social clubs in Spain. I don't know whether people are familiar with this, but it's basically a community cooperative, membership-based association that operates on a non-profit basis. So it is regulated, and these are licensed entities managed by licensed trained individuals where adult members can participate and access a legal supply of cannabis that is supplied within the members on a non-profit basis. So there's no commercial incentive to recruit new members, to make money, to sell more cannabis, to do anything like that. And basically we've borrowed this idea that's now been legislated. It emerged as a sort of activist-led thing in Spain. I'm talking about cannabis here, but the model has been copied in real-world legislation in Uruguay, Malta, and Germany now. So interestingly, an activist-led model has now entered the legislation in other countries. So they pioneered this idea. And basically, the idea is to borrow that idea, but have it for plant-based psychedelics. So you have membership-based, non-profit, adult members could access plant-based psychedelics. I mean, mostly mushrooms, I think, if we're being honest. It would be mostly mushrooms, but potentially mescaline cactus and perhaps some DMT-containing plants as well. And it can operate, an interesting thing about it can operate within a decriminalisation model. You don't really need, it's kind of like a collective decriminalisation. So you don't need to legalise. You could nominally do it, like they have done in Spain, within their a decriminalisation framework rather than going for full legalisation. So you don't necessarily have to change the law. So it could be used as a kind of transitional model between where we are now, war on drugs, blanket prohibition, and a more formally regulated market. But it also, I think it has a role in any future market as well, alongside a regulated retail market, home growing, and any other models that I'll come on to. So the third idea is for a regulated retail model, and you'll be familiar with this idea. It's called a shop. A shop, imagine that. And it's not just like a supermarket. There would be certain conditions around it. Obviously, only adults could access it. Only adults would, in fact, be able to enter the premises. Quality control products, both plant and potentially synthetic as well. There would be things like packaging controls, and we mocked up some packaging. We've mocked up packaging for LSD and synthetic mescaline, but you could have cactus, plant-based mescaline stuff as well. People look at these and go, "Oh, that's a bit miserable, isn't it? It looks like a pharmaceutical drug. It looks like a pharma drug." Well, there's a reason for that. Pharmaceutical drug packaging is primarily functional. It's not marketing or branding based. You have the name of the drug, how much is in there, what the dosage is, health warnings, a QR code so you can find access to harm reduction information, services and so on. It's purely functional, child-proofing, tamper-proofing, all of that stuff you have with pharmaceutical drugs. Yes, that's what we want. And people go, "Oh, but it might have a bad trip." Or it's like, well, if you want, once you've bought it, you can take it out and put it in your little paisley pouch from Nepal or whatever. We shouldn't be selling it like that with sort of little psychedelic colours and unicorns and stuff on it, because that would inform people's trip in another way. So yes, it's functional, but this is the kind of thinking behind it. This is functional, it's public health, it's pragmatic, it's not about branding or marketing or influencing your trips in any other way. You would have specialist licensed, so it would be more, maybe a bit more like a pharmacy, but or an off-license, where you have a licensed premises to sell, but the vendor would be trained and required to give information to the purchaser on the products, how to use them safely. You know, have you got a history of mental health problems? Have you used this before? And be able to give you advice on how to use these things safely, and potentially say, look, really, you shouldn't be trying this. This is not for you. There'd be no marketing or branding. I've already covered that. There'd be no edibles. I'm not into putting drugs in sweets. Just seems like a bad idea. I'm sorry, people who like cannabis edibles, don't put drugs in sweets. There's obviously a bad thing to do because kids will eat them, and they do. Where kids will eat, I like sweets, but but what you should do is take some cannabis and buy a fucking bag of Haribo and eat it. Don't mix them together, and certainly don't mix potent psychedelics together. Just buy some fucking sweets and take them with your drug. Don't mix them together. That's stupid because kids will eat them and end up in A&E, and that's what happens. So let's not do that. And options for state monopoly retailing. This is a bit like the social clubs, non-profit option. If you have a state monopoly, like they do with cannabis in Quebec, is run by the Quebec government, the retail end of it, not the production of the actual products. And if you have, and a few other places, like in Sweden, alcohol is sold as a state monopoly. So there are examples with cannabis and alcohol around the world. What it does is it removes that. In theory, the government is not. They're more interested in the public good than in private profit. So they're not going to have the same incentive to increase sales and maximise profits. There are risks there. Governments are not all sort of entirely benign, but generally, I think it's quite an interesting model that's worth looking at. Talked a little bit about that already. And the fourth model, and these four models, by the way, we envisage running in parallel, is regulated, commercial, supervised or guided experiences. So it's kind of more like the retreat model, although they don't all have to be fancy pants exclusive, sort of $7,000 for a weekend type retreats. It could be community-run things that would be free, or people who forage or whatever. I think it's really important to learn lessons from traditional ceremonial use. I think there's been quite a lot of chatter about this at the conference. I think the people administering the drugs need to be licensed and need to have formal training for obvious reasons. It's a non-trivial thing. People are vulnerable, people are at risk, you need to know how to deal with adverse incidents. You need training for that. People shouldn't go into that lightly. And we talk about how you would do that in the book. Participants need to be screened. I've already talked about this in terms of vending, but some people, it's not appropriate or useful or purely from a health and well-being perspective for them to be taking powerful psychedelics. Some people aren't in the right state of mind, or they may have mental health problems and be extremely vulnerable, and they shouldn't be doing it. You need to have some form of screening. And the key is basically ensuring the welfare of participants, and you need to have some accountability and liability to avoid risks of exploitation. There are obvious safety issues, false medical claims, all of these things. I mean, these are fairly regular discussions at a conference like this in the context of the whole sort of trip scene. Things like consensual touch. These are basic safeguarding principles. And particularly where it is a commercial enterprise and where it becomes a transactional thing, there has to be a level of regulation so that people are protected. Because there are grifters. Unfortunately, there are a lot of grifters. And it only takes a few bad actors to fuck everything up for everybody else. And they then create a massive regulatory burden for everybody else because someone was abusive or someone didn't do the appropriate medical emergency intervention or whatever it is. So that's the fourth model. Those four models, we imagine them operating in parallel. I don't think there's anything particularly revolutionary in there. They're all models that kind of exist in one form or another for other things already. But just more overarching on a sort of holistic basis is the idea of embedding social justice and equity in the new model. One of the things we have an opportunity with legalizing and regulating drugs is that we get to design, it's like playing The Sims or something, one of those God games. You get to design the world that you want. And we can do things differently, and we can do things better. And you can embed social justice and equity principles from the outset into these models. And I'm talking about things like preventing the emergence of monopolies and corporate capture, like we've seen with alcohol and tobacco, where a small group of massive transnational corporations own about 4 or 5 corporates own about 80% of the tobacco and alcohol industry. And that gives them so much money and power, they are then able to leverage that in the interest of their profit, not in the interest of public health. They fight any public health regulation at every corner. They can basically tell governments what to do, especially smaller governments. We need to not have that happen with psychedelics. We can implement equity programs. This is another thing that comes from the world of cannabis, where you kind of acknowledge that certain populations and demographics were disproportionately impacted by harms of the war on drugs, and then you help you preference them in the new market to participate on a preferential basis, whether it's licensing, whether it's jumping the queue in terms of licensing, issuing, whether it's training, whether it's capital grants and so on. You support those communities and individuals, people who've had criminal records, for example, for minor drug offences. You support them to participate in the emerging industry. Reinvesting into impacted communities. So some of the profits from these emerging markets, if they are commercialised, and there are profits to be had, not necessarily if it's non-profit model or state monopoly, that may not be the case. But if you have a commercial market, some of the profits via taxation can be redirected into communities and individuals who have been disproportionately impacted by the harms of the war on drugs. And again, they do it in the US. So 70% of the tax take in New Jersey from cannabis is reinvested into social programs for 70% for disproportionately impacted communities. 70% of the tax take, just think about that, in the USA, that sort of land of free markets and neoliberal capitalism. They have this remarkable thing happening with cannabis. 40% of the tax in New York is reinvested into equity programs and disproportionately impacted communities. Amazing. If they can do it there, imagine if they did that with oil or, petrol or something. 70% of the tax take is pretty amazing. And they can do it there, you can do it anywhere. And ensuring justice for indigenous communities, and I'll come back to that in a minute. Preventing corporate capture, I've kind of touched on this. Really, we want to be supporting a diverse market of small and medium-sized business. We don't want monopolisation and oligopolies and so on. Limit it. You can do that easily when you design your policy. You just limit the amount of the market that any one commercial entity can own. That you limit the number of licenses. They do it in Massachusetts with cannabis. You can only have 3 cannabis licenses. So you can't get monopolies because there's 650 odd licenses and you can only have 3, maximum, 1 each person. So again, these are things you can design in to prevent bad things happening, but you need to do it at the start because it's very difficult to retroactively re-engineer a sort of monopoly or oligopoly market. Preventing licenses for existing companies engaging in parallel activities. So the big medical psychedelics providers, big alcohol, big tobacco, big pharma, don't let them anywhere fucking near the regulated psychedelics market. Just no, you're not welcome. You're bad actors. You don't get a license, sorry. And it's like, well, how are you going to do that? It's like, well, I'll write it into the law. But that doesn't seem fair. I don't care. Exploring non-commercial market models, we've talked about this, social clubs and state monopolies and so on, things like that. Briefly, protecting religious and indigenous uses. Some psychedelics have their roots in indigenous culture, and again, there's been a lot of discussion about this. Not all of them. LSD doesn't particularly. Magic mushrooms, maybe some places, but not others. But certain ones, certainly DMT-containing plants, peyote cactus, they have deep roots in indigenous cultures and traditional ceremonial practices and sacred medicines and so on. We need to learn from that, but we also need to respect them. You can see already industry actors are seeking to exploit that traditional knowledge without any kind of reparations. You're seeing stupid shit like ayahuasca pills. They're marketing ayahuasca pills, a premix of DMT and an MAO inhibitor. and calling it ayahuasca. I mean, it's just deeply offensive, exploitative bullshit, and we need to push back against it. But I think policy design, again, we can hardwire this stuff into the design process through equity process and reparations of tax payments, and making sure that indigenous voices are included in the policy-making process, and they've always historically been excluded. They don't have to be going forward. So what about those other drugs? So there are other drugs that aren't psychedelics. There are other drugs, and psychedelics are different in some ways. They have a different risk profile. They're not associated with death. They're not associated with dependence and addiction. But they are still associated with certain risks. And from a policy perspective, they're not really that different. You identify, if you're designing regulatory policy, you look at the risks, you look at the vulnerabilities, you look at the regulatory tools you have, and you kind of workshop it to lead to what's going to give you the best outcomes in terms of minimizing social and health harms and maximizing benefits. And we do that with psychedelics as well, and that's basically what we've proposed in the book. For some people in the psychedelic scene, they may be special, they may be elevated because of their spiritual context or whatever it is. But from a policy perspective, they're really not that different. And I think we need to be very careful, wary of psychedelic exceptionalism. I'm sure that's a phrase most of you be familiar with, that somehow psychedelics are special or better, or they should be legalized but not other drugs. We need to legalize all drugs. Drug use is a reality. People use all kinds of drugs. We can't just say only these drugs because we like them, or only these drugs because they're a bit less risky. You need to regulate the more risky drugs because they are more risky. That's why they need regulation. Regulation is about managing and minimizing risk. So we need to regulate the most dangerous drugs kind of the most urgently, because that's actually where the biggest public health wins come. There isn't that big a public health footprint from psychedelics. I mean, there is some, but not negative public health footprint, I mean. But there's a huge one from heroin, for example. But illegal heroin is extremely dangerous, especially if you're sharing needles, you're doing it in unhygienic sort of backstreet environments and so on. Clinical heroin is completely safe. No one ever dies from legal heroin in a medical context, or even in a prescribed, like a Swiss-style prescribing clinic. So it is prohibition and illegality that makes drugs that are already a bit risky way more risky. And regulation is about flipping that round. So you don't remove all the risks, but you remove all the risks associated with illegal production and supply. That's what regulation is all about. And we need to do that with psychedelics too. It depends. Different drugs, they're not regulated in the same way because they have different risk profiles. And the reason that this book's 70 pages and the cannabis book is 400 pages and the cocaine book is like 600 pages is because the more risky a drug is, the harder it is to regulate because there's more stuff, there's more risks to try and get to grips with. And my final point really is about the need for the psychedelics movement to engage not just in psychedelics legalization and regulation for all uses, not just medical use and medical research, but for recreational and use in social settings as well. And that kind of fuzzy therapeutic well-being set of uses that exists between clinical medical stuff and recreational stuff. And there's a kind of a Venn diagram, I appreciate, of a whole different set of motivations for psychedelic use, and they kind of overlap, but just if we were going to summarize it, there's kind of clinical medical, there's kind of wellness, informal therapeutic, and there's sort of recreational social setting stuff, but they obviously overlap. We need to regulate psychedelics for all of those motivations and uses, because that's the world we live in, and we can't change that. We might wish to change it, but we can't. And as pragmatic policymakers, we have to deal with the world as we find it and manage and regulate behaviors as they exist. We can't just wish them away. That's what the war on drugs has been trying to do for 50 years, and clearly it's not worked at all. But the movement, the wider drug reform movement, needs the solidarity and allyship of the psychedelic movement. And historically, it hasn't really had it, with a few notable exceptions like Rick Doblin and MAPS and a few others. large parts of the psychedelic scene seem very disconnected from the wider drug law reform movement. And I think it's worth reminding you that a lot of the opportunities that people in the psychedelic scene enjoy now in terms of access to psychedelic medicines, in terms of the legalization and regulation, things that are going on in places like Colorado and Oregon and Michigan and Jamaica and elsewhere, a lot of that progress has been because of the wider drug law reform movement. It's to do with space that's opened up off the back of cannabis legalization. The psychedelic renaissance would not be happening, and these conferences would not be happening, and you probably wouldn't be here if it wasn't for the work of the drug law reform movement over the last 30, 40 years. So I'm not saying you owe us, but you do. And you kind of do. And not you owe us, but I think you owe us your solidarity and allyship. I'm not saying you owe us money, although that would be nice as well. You're all part of this. You are all part of the drug law reform movement. You are all activists for change and reform. And we need your support and allyship in the wider drug law reform movement. So please just think about it and try and support the ecosystem of reform organisations like Transform and like Release and services who are doing innovation stuff like in Bristol, and the Green Party have brilliant drug policy. And there is a lot of brilliant activism and activity going on in drug law reform, and we need your support and allyship, and yes, basically dedicate your entire lives to drug law reform from here on. And this last point was kind of about trauma, which is, like Rick was talking about net zero trauma by 20. I hate that, to be honest. But if we're serious about ending trauma, we have to deal with the war on drugs. The war on drugs is a key driver of trauma globally. There's 100,000 people a year are dying in drug war violence in Mexico. Just think about that. Everyone talks about, there's 100,000 people dying from fentanyl in the US. Yeah, that's terrible, and that's all to do with the drug war as well, by the way. They're not even dying from drug use. Drug war violence. More than 10,000 people a month. That's nearly 300 people a day. It's totally appalling level of bloodletting. And we're just completely oblivious to it. In Colombia, millions of people displaced. In other places, overdose deaths, mass incarceration. 20%, conservatively, around 20% of the 12 million people incarcerated around the world are in prison for non-violent drug offences. So more than 2.5 million people. It's a key driver of trauma. And about 15% of people who go to prison in the UK, this is an incredible stat, who didn't have a drug problem, leave prison with a drug dependency. So not only are we putting people in prison who shouldn't be there, we are fueling drug misuse and drug dependency through the trauma of our prison system. So yes, please do support the wider drug policy and law reform. And if you're interested in that, please do contact me, Transform, or any of the other organisations here. Like LEAP or the Green Party and Release, and there's a whole bunch of cool organisations, and you can ask me and I can tell you about all of them. One last little point before I finish was about international law, because a few people don't realise that people kind of think that all drugs are banned under international law, and they kind of are, but psychedelic plants are actually exempt under the UN drug treaties. So mescaline, psilocybin and DMT are all Schedule 1 under the UN drug treaty, so they are banned globally as the most dangerous drugs alongside fentanyl and heroin and cocaine and so on, which is obviously a bit stupid, but that's the drug laws for you. But this is from the commentary to the 1971 UN drug treaty. The cultivation, I can't read it, cultivation of plants from which psychotropic substances are obtained is not controlled by the Vienna Convention. Neither the crown, fruit, mescal button, or the peyote cactus, nor the roots of the plant, psilocybin mushrooms themselves, are included in Schedule 1, but only their respective principles, blah, blah, blah. What that means is the plants are not prohibited. So if domestically you wanted to have a commercial market and regulate the plants themselves, you can do that, and you could have an international trade in psychedelic plants. It's not covered, but as soon as you extract them or synthesize them, then it's Schedule 1. I mean, that will maybe change one day, but in the meantime, there is at least an opportunity and an opening. And just to put this in perspective, so cannabis, opium, and coca leaf that cocaine comes from are all specifically banned by name. So the plants themselves are banned, whereas with the psychedelic plants, they are specifically exempt. So there is a distinction. Yes, quickly. I don't know about iboga. It's not named in that thing, but I think presumably it's similar. Yes, it's not. I don't think it's covered. If you extract whatever the drug in ibogaine is, what is the drug in that? Oh, well, there you go. Clues in the name. Okay, so all of this stuff I've just been rabbiting on. It's covered in a lot more detail here. Please do go and read it. Please get in touch with Transform if you're interested in doing more on any of this. Please do get involved in the wider drug law reform movement. Psychedelic stuff is super important, but the bigger stuff is even more so, and they are not disconnected. It's all linked together. You're all part of that movement, whether you like it or not. So please do support drug law reform. Thanks very much.